In the life of Lisa, a 50-year-old teacher, there seemed to be no room for surprises. Married, teaching, living a measured life where everything went according to plan. But fate had something completely unpredictable in store for her, something that would turn her world upside down. She could never have imagined she would be drawn into a situation where her reputation, marriage, and possibly even her freedom would be at stake. Lisa had never believed in omens or signs of destiny. Her world was clearly structured, like a straight line connecting must and should. But one morning, as she stepped through the door of the staff room, she felt something strange. An inexplicable mystery hung in the air, one she felt in her bones but couldn't unravel. Walking down the corridor with a stack of books in her arms, she mechanically registered the faces of her students. Among them, Gustavo stood out, always in the back row with a mysterious smile and a gaze that said more than it should. She tried to convince herself he was just like any other student. But that morning, their eyes met, as if time had paused for a few seconds. A slight blush crept up Lisa's cheeks, and she noticed a mischievous smirk appear at the corner of Gustavo's mouth. Hastily looking away, she tried to focus on taking attendance and starting the lesson as usual. Yet, as she spoke, she felt Gustavo's heavy gaze upon her, a look unlike a student's ordinary attention. Then, suddenly, as she was writing on the board with chalk, a small folded scrap of paper fell to the floor. Picking it up, Lisa saw uneven letters forming words, "I want to meet you today during the break." Her heart pounded wildly, and her mind filled with questions she was afraid to ask even herself. Gustavo cast a fleeting glance at her, then pretended to be engrossed in taking notes again. Lisa stood with the note in her hand, feeling as if the entire room knew her secret, a secret she herself didn't fully grasp. The bell rang, as if tearing through the tense moment. The break was approaching, and Lisa didn't know what was worse, meeting Gustavo's gaze or being alone with her thoughts. The minutes until the next lesson dragged agonizingly slowly. She needed to concentrate, but one thought pulsed in her head: why couldn't she just ignore this? The day, which had started as usual, suddenly felt wrong. The universe seemed to be playing with her, sending subtle signals. Every word written on the board felt impossibly heavy. Every student's gaze lingered longer than usual. And then there was Gustavo, always the last to look away, as if testing the invisible boundaries between them. His gaze held something more than just a student's interest in a teacher, something that felt almost offensive and simultaneously unsettling. As she explained the symbolism of Machado de Assis, Lisa felt her face flush again. It was impossible to ignore. He knew she had noticed. And worst of all, a part of her couldn't tear herself away from this silent game. The other students were engrossed in their notebooks, but he looked directly at her, with a barely perceptible smile at the corner of his mouth, a provocation that no one but her could understand. Suddenly, she heard the soft sound of paper being folded. For a moment, she froze, trying to ignore the sheet that fell onto her desk. Her heart was pounding. Gathering all her will, she finished her sentence and picked up the note. "Meet me during the break in the third-floor bathroom," the short note read. Every word felt impossibly heavy. Lisa felt her body react before her mind, and her breath caught. Her voice trembled as she continued the lesson, but Gustavo, of course, noticed. A silent triumph was etched on his face, as if he knew the seed had been planted. There were only a few minutes left until the break, but they stretched out like an eternity. Fragments of thoughts swirled in Lisa's mind: this can't be happening. This is madness. The bell rang, and the students immediately jumped from their seats. A certainty washed over Lisa: she needed to decide what to do before it was too late. There are situations that, it seems, you should simply ignore, but some unknown force pushes you in the wrong direction. This was exactly what Lisa felt as she opened the note Gustavo had passed to her so discreetly that it seemed as if even the air in the room had momentarily frozen. The neatly folded slip of paper contained a short but potent message, written in black ink: "In the third-floor bathroom during break." Simple and direct. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Such a note from a student could be a real ticking time bomb. She looked at Gustavo, sitting at the back of the class, and saw him nod obediently, as if simply listening attentively to the lesson. But Lisa knew that every one of his movements was carefully calculated, and the most frightening thing was that she felt something trembling inside her, something she should never have felt. What would happen next? Would Lisa be able to resist the temptation and keep her life on its former course, or would she succumb to the suddenly ignited feelings, risking losing everything? The answer to that question would be given very soon. The rest of the school day passed in futile attempts to concentrate, but words left her mouth as if she were a soulless automaton. In Gustavo's every gaze, there was a silent question: will you dare, or won't you? During the break, as the laughter of teachers filled the staff room and the hum of student voices echoed in the corridors, she felt like a rudderless boat, carried away by a dangerous current. She needed to make a decision, and the relentless march of time only seemed to heighten her confusion. What had come over her? Perhaps it was the monotony of everyday life, whose weight had suddenly become unbearable. Or perhaps it was Gustavo's gaze, that reckless gleam in the eyes of someone unaware of the consequences. The note still rested in her skirt pocket, folded as if that could diminish the scale of the impending problem. In the third-floor bathroom during break, these words insistently echoed in her head, like a drumbeat reverberating off the walls of her mind. When the bell rang, her first reaction was to run away. Away from the classroom, away from the note, away from the thoughts that could pull her into madness. But against her better judgment, her steps led her to the third floor, not the staff room. The corridors were almost deserted, with only an occasional student rushing past, engrossed in laughter over something trivial. There was no room for laughter in her soul, only the sound of her heels echoing in the silence, as if the floor itself sought to betray her presence. Reaching the bathroom door, she froze. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. From inside, the sound of dripping water could be heard. Every falling drop seemed to pierce her very consciousness. A desire to turn back overwhelmed her. She remembered everything that was at stake: her husband, her job, her reputation. At that moment, a quiet voice, full of anticipation, whispered, "Teacher, is that you?" The hand gripping the doorknob trembled. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Gustavo was there. The air was filled with something inexpressible, a sense of life she had so desperately lacked. She tried to utter words, to say that this was madness, that it couldn't happen, but before she could speak, he stepped forward, giving her a smile that blended defiance and admiration, and the sound of the door closing behind her made her heart stop for a moment. The cold walls of the bathroom seemed to conspire to amplify the guilt that tormented her. Every breath felt like thunder in a silent storm. She should have left. She should have turned around and left Gustavo there, but she couldn't. He stood motionless, his gaze full of a determination uncharacteristic of his young age. "You came," he said, almost a whisper, but his voice resonated within her like a shout. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Words deserted her, leaving only the deafening thump of her heart filling the void. He moved closer, and the scent of youth, of rebellion, filled her like a forbidden aroma. It wasn't just attraction. It was a magnet, pulling her against her will. Doubt and certainty mingled in a vortex from which there was no escape. "This is wrong," she finally managed to utter, but her voice trembled, and even to herself, it didn't sound convincing. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Then why are you here?" His question cut like a razor blade, severing any attempt at an excuse. She didn't know what to say. Time seemed to slow. His hand touched hers, a slight tremor ran through her fingers, and a moment arrived when the world ceased to exist. It was as if they were alone in the universe. Outside, in the corridor, footsteps were heard, and for a moment, she wondered what would happen if they were discovered. But that thought vanished as quickly as it appeared, drowned out by a desire she could no longer control. It was in that moment, full of forbidden yearning, that she pulled Gustavo towards her. He touched her body beneath her shirt and kissed her lips. She felt a craving she had never experienced before. Then she pulled down his pants and began to caress him. He was impressively endowed, which only intensified her desire. They spent about half an hour there, enough time to quench her passion. When it was over, she stood leaning against the closed door, trying to catch her breath. He smiled with that confident smirk unique to youth, and casually adjusted his uniform, as if nothing had happened. "You're incredible, you know that," he said and walked out before she could answer. His words echoed in her mind. She stood motionless, looking at her reflection, and felt like laughing at herself. The sounds of voices outside grew louder, but in her head, only one question persistently resonated: what now? When the door closed, the world ceased to exist for a moment. She leaned against the sink, as if physical contact could compensate for the emotional shock. The silence was deafening, yet not enough to drown out the echo of her choice. Her gaze desperately sought her reflection in the mirror, as if hoping to see a version of herself there that could comfort her, a stronger, more consistent Lisa, capable of handling the chasm she had just created. But what she saw was only a cruel reflection, shattered into distorted lines that crossed the glass like cracks running through her own soul. "What have you done, Lisa?" she whispered, but her own voice seemed alien to her, like an echo reflecting from the mirror surface, mocking her in despair. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately trying to erase those moments, those sensations, those words that, it seemed to her, were forever etched in the reflection. But the cracks that cut across the mirror's surface remained a sinister reminder that some actions simply cannot be erased from the past. A distant sound of footsteps from the corridor brought her back to reality. She imagined muffled laughter and whispers, as if everyone around knew what had happened, as if the very walls of the corridors had become all-seeing eyes and all-hearing ears. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open to leave, but an invisible heaviness, like a crushing weight, hung in the air. And so she continued on her way, keeping the secret deep within her to this day. There are moments when she feels like a prisoner of this secret. She desperately wants to share everything with her husband, but she is paralyzed by the fear that he might do something irreversible.